Hi, welcome back. I am here with another fantasy recommendation video for you. I have been doing a series of fantasy recommendation videos and I will link that playlist up above if you want to go and check it out. It is curating lists of different types of fantasy that you might be into. In today's video, I'm going to be recommending to you 11 great standalone fantasy novels. If you're not looking to get into a series, but you want some fantasy or fantastical elements in your life, sometimes a standalone fantasy is what you need. So I'm going to be recommending 11 of my favorites. I will say a couple of these are books that do have companion novels or maybe turned into a series, but completely standalone as their own story, and you really don't need to read anything else. Like, it will do a pretty good job of wrapping things up. My first pick for this list is a book that's kind of a blend of fantasy and historical fiction, and that is Circe by Madeline Miller. This I would call literary historical fantasy, and I loved it. This is a book for people who like slow-paced, character-driven novels. I'm gonna recommend the audiobook. I think it is brilliantly done. Circe is a reimagining of Greek mythology through the perspective of the witch Circe. In a lot of ways, it is deeply feminist that gives her a voice when she's often been a side character. I think it's a beautiful, incredibly compelling character study. I know not everybody likes this. Like I said, it is very character driven, so if you want a lot of plot, you're not gonna get it here, but as a fan of good character driven novels, I loved it. And as someone who's somewhat familiar with Greek mythology, I found it really interesting. I do have a full review of this book. If you guys are interested, I will link it up above if you want to hear more of my thoughts. My next recommendation to you is a indie fantasy romance book, and that is Radiance by Grace Draven. This is a really fantastic romance novel. Now, it is the first in a series, however, I think it can and should be probably read as a standalone. If you just like ignore the epilogue, you can read it as a standalone, and it's like perfectly great, which I would recommend. You can continue on if you want. From what I hear, it isn't as amazing as this one, and I love it so much. This one involves a political marriage of convenience plot between these two characters who are of different species who find each other's species to be physically repulsive. But there are these wonderful people who decide to make the best of it, and so it's sort of a friends to lovers where eventually they fall for each other, and it's really sweet and really beautiful. They have a fantastic relationship. They have great communication with each other. They handle conflict really well. And that's not something that you always see a lot of. All of the conflict in their relationship is external. It's things that are happening in the world around them, but their relationship is always really solid. So I love this. I think it's a really wonderful, sweet romance novel, and I definitely think it can be read as a standalone. The next book that I want to recommend to you is another one that is technically historical fiction, but with some gothic, fantastical elements to it, and so I'm going to throw it in here. This is The Raven's Tale by Kat Winters. I really enjoyed this a lot, and also it's just like a beautiful book. Thank you to Abrams for sending me a finished copy. They had heard that I read it and liked it and asked if they could send me. Guys, look, it's so pretty. Anyway, so The Raven's Tale is a reimagining of the life of a young Edgar Allan Poe. I really liked it. I think it's smart and interesting in the way that it does it. So you get the historical elements of it that are really well researched, but with this fantastical element tacked on, where you get the personification of his muse as this macabre young woman. And there's a lot of kind of intense content in here. Poe did not have an easy life, and so there is definitely some emotional abuse that takes place between him and his foster father, and some other things that happen. But I really enjoyed it. I think if you like Edgar Allan Poe, if you like kind of the macabre or a darker gothic sensibility mixed with your historical fiction, this is one worth picking up. It's got that kind of mystical, magical element to it, but with some real world implications, which is interesting. The next book that I want to recommend to you is another one that I think is going to be getting a sequel, but definitely works as a standalone. I don't think it needs anything else. The story completely wraps up, and this easily could have just been a standalone. It is The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert. Guys, I really love this. This is another book that's kind of polarizing because I think some people don't like one or both of the elements that are in this book. It's a little bit of a genre blend. The first half of the book, I would say, is kind of a urban fantasy story, and the second half of the book becomes a portal fantasy with some absurd elements, like almost like if you like Alice in Wonderland, that kind of like dark, absurd fairy tale type thing, that's what you get in the second half of this book, which I know not everybody likes, but I loved it. Also, our main character, I really liked our main character, but she's like an unlikable female character. She's like not necessarily a good person and doesn't always make great choices, but I enjoyed her anyway. So I loved this book. I thought it was really interesting. I think it's best to not know a whole lot going in, but yeah, I really enjoyed it. So The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert. My next recommendation is one that's definitely going to come with some big content warnings. I know this is not the book for everybody. A lot of people did not like it, but I really loved it. It was one of my favorite books last year. This is Damsel by Elana K. Arnold, and it was a National Book Award finalist, so congrats to Elana K. Arnold. This is an interesting one because I would say that it's actually feminist horror dressed up like a fairy tale. So it's got these sort of fairy tale trappings, but at the heart of it, it's kind of a horror novel about gaslighting and rape culture and toxic masculinity, and I loved it. It's really intense. There are multiple scenes of on-the-page sexual harassment and sexual assault. There's a lot of like kind of disturbing imagery in here, but I thought it was really well done. I thought it was really powerful. I think it's an important book, and I found the end of it to be very empowering. So I loved it. So I'm gonna recommend this. It's not gonna be the book for everyone, again, but I'm a fan. My next recommendation is another one that was one of my favorite books last year. I love this book so much, and I think it's really underrated. This is The Beautiful Ones by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This one just has a little bit of magic, a hint of magical realism to it, but in a lot of ways it feels like a modern blend of Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters with some magic. And I love everything about it. So if you like those authors, I think definitely check it out. It's another one that is pretty character driven. It is not very plot driven, and it feels like the Bronte sisters or like Jane Austen in that it's about courtship and manners and society. And so if you like those sorts of books, you may enjoy this. I thought it was fascinating. There's some really interesting characters. There's a fully fleshed kind of villain, and I love well-written villains, which you get in here. I would say, and the reason that I say it's like halfway in between is it's definitely not as dark as the Bronte sisters, but it's darker than Jane Austen. So it's like halfway in between. So if you like that, if that sounds good to you, I recommend you pick it up. I think it's beautiful, and it is a standalone. My next recommendation is another true fantasy standalone, and actually a debut novel, which I think is pretty impressive. This is To Kill a Kingdom by Alexandra Christo. It is a loose retelling of The Little Mermaid, but with sirens, and it's pretty violent, I would say. Like, it's a stabby Little Mermaid story. I really enjoyed it. I think it's really good. I think it's very well written, and especially for a debut novel, I thought it was pretty impressive. So there's another standalone fantasy novel for you. Next, I'm going to talk about a book that is, I would say, more horror than fantasy, but it definitely has some fantasy elements to it, and it is one that I love, so I'm putting it on this list anyway, because I can do that. That is Sawkill Girls by Claire Legrand. Oh, guys, this is so good. So here's my pitch for this book. This is sort of like Stranger Things meets Buffy the Vampire Slayer, except way scarier, super feminist, and hella queer. It's so good. It's so good. I devoured this book. Claire Legrand is a favorite author for me anyway, but I loved Sawkill Girls. It's really, really creepy. It definitely has some more mystical urban fantasy type elements to it, hence the reference to Stranger Things and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But yeah, it's great. In terms of being queer, I think it's really interesting. This is told from the perspective of 3 girls on this place called Sawkill Island, where there's a monster that's trying to like eat girls, basically, and girls are disappearing. And so it follows these 3 perspectives. One of the girls is biracial and asexual. One of the girls is bisexual, and one of the girls I think is gay, from what I can tell. And it is Own Voices for bisexual representation. But I loved everything about this. It's like super feminist. It's like destroy the patriarchy, but really scary, and it's so good. Anyway, so if that sounds good to you, go check it out. It's a great standalone. My next recommendation is technically the first in a series, but the second book is a companion novel, so these can be read as standalones, but I think they work well together if you read them together, if that helps. So I'm going to show you the first book in the series. This is Reign the Earth by A.C. Gaughen. I would call this a new adult fantasy novel, and it is one that deals with domestic abuse and domestic violence and the sort of cycles of abuse that can take place in those relationships. It starts with a political marriage, and there is magic and there's political intrigue, and I loved it. I think it is powerful, I think it is beautifully written, and I loved it, so I recommend it. Like I said, there is another book in the Elemente series, and I think there may be more coming, but they're companion novels. They follow completely different sets of characters. There's a little bit of crossover, but yeah, you can just read this on its own if you want to. My next recommendation is another one that's the first in a series. I don't know if I'm going to continue though, because I feel like you can read this as a standalone, and I don't know that I necessarily want to continue. I may try. We'll see. I did enjoy this. This is Heartstone by Elle Katharine White. And this is basically Pride and Prejudice in a fantasy world where Darcy is a badass dragon rider. It's great. It's really fun. I mean, that's pretty much what it is. Like, if you ever thought to yourself, it would be really cool to have Pride and Prejudice in a fantasy world with dragons, then go read Heartstone, because that's basically what this is. I really liked it. I thought it was fun. I gave this one 4 stars. There are going to be 2 other books in the series, but I don't know what she's going to do, because this pretty much retells all of Pride and Prejudice. So I guess she could write more in the world, and that's fine, but like this completely works as a standalone, so go check it out. My last recommendation for you today is another indie published fantasy novel, and this is more of a fantasy romance. It is The Last Dragon Princess by Cynthia Payne. I really enjoyed this. It was one of my favorite indie books that I read last year, and it takes some really, really cool twists and turns that I can't tell you about because it would be spoiling things. But suffice to say, it follows a young woman who has these markings on her back. That means that she is a breeder, where she's able to give birth to male dragon shapeshifters, and yeah, there's dragon shapeshifters, and it's really good. It's really good. Yes?
Did you buy me sandals?
You have the, yeah, where did you put them?
Mommy, I was wondering where you put them.
I didn't put them anywhere. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. I recommend you go check it out. So there you have it. Those are the 11 standalone, or mostly standalone, fantasy novels that I have to recommend to you today. I know sometimes you just want a good fantasy novel and you don't want to get sucked into a whole series if you don't have to. So these are really great options if that is what you are looking for. Talk to me in the comments down below and let me know any of your thoughts on any of the books that I talked about today. And if you have any recommendations for other great standalone fantasy novels, leave them in the comments down below. I'm sure other people are going to be looking for them. Question of the day: what is one of your favorite standalone fantasy novels? It could be one of the books I talked about here. It could be another one that you've read and really loved. Let me know your thoughts. If you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.